How about now? How about now? Now it's working. Okay, I guess the sound is on now. So what I was saying is that I did a bit of research today looking into, how far have we come in science kind of validating this new paradigm, which is based on overthrowing it's not the entire thing, but our strongest bit of evidence, our strongest, the most powerful artillery in our armory is anything that overthrows this notion that consciousness arises from neurons. And this is actually not a new situation where we have overwhelming evidence that says that it does not arise from the brain. And this goes back at least to the early 90s. I don't know when the actual study happened. I only know when the guy that did the study died, only because that's just the bit of information that I recall. You guys can Google this and find it. But basically, a guy that was a doctor went into a clinic because he was having chronic headaches, and they did a brain scan, and he only had a small sac of fluid at the end of his spine. The man was a doctor. So this inspired the researcher to look for other people with similar conditions, and a study was eventually done on about 200 of these people, 20% of whom had above average IQs, and the doctor wasn't the only person that was in an exceptional position in life. There was also a math genius, I think a lot more recently, that only had 5% of his brain. And this is really nothing compared to the things that have come after and the implications of those things. One of those things is that Mimosa pudica, for example, has memory. Another one of those things is that Venus flytraps can count. Not only trees, but certain plants can apparently recognize their relatives, and they can feel pain. They know when they're being eaten. So, the next time someone asks you if you're vegan and you're not, you're a meat eater, you can say, well, they actually have more senses than us. There's not any evidence that a cow can recognize its own relatives, so I don't know what kind of psychopath would eat a plant knowing how much more sentient they are than us, which is hilarious from my point of view. So, the point being that, we got slime molds, single-celled organisms engineering subway systems better than humans with computers, and we have all of this evidence that cognition has got nothing to do with brains and neurons. And then we have the work of Michael Levin suggesting that it is a field that interpenetrates everything, that retains the information that we have contributed or attributed to genetics. And then we have an unfortunate consequence of all these developments. Because what we need to be doing as a species is moving distinctly forward. So, the idea of Terence McKenna's Archaic Revival, that the old ways would return, that's obviously happening. Panpsychism is emerging as a frontier in modern scientific thinking. That is the bullet point of this presentation. But the unfortunate consequence of that, in my opinion, is that a lot of people are regressing into old superstitious Bronze Age or older modalities of thinking. And I think the perception that the entire modern era was a misstep, that it was all a mistake, really does a discredit to the universal mind. I mean, when you see the complexity and sophistication and beauty, well, if you don't connect here, get the fuck out. I'm not really that concerned about that, particularly. We're trying to get people here that do connect, so peace out. Anyways, that person probably is a great example of what I was about to say. There's a lot of people that are kind of going back to this, sort of outdated modality. And the real point, I think, is to take everything, like Bob Dylan said in 1959 or whatever, take what you have gathered from coincidence. The highway is for gamblers, you better use your sense. You know, that we take all of these things and developments from the modern world, the critical thinking of science, the protocol, the wisdom and the lessons that we have acquired through the modern age, and avail ourselves of the technology and realize that the ancients weren't actually retarded, that they knew a lot of stuff that we don't, or that we didn't. And as this stuff reemerges, we integrate it all together and come up with an absolutely new paradigm that is closer to the truth than humanity has ever been before. What if I'm a god? She says, well, you're not a god, you're but a splinter of God. But that's not what I'm here for tonight. What I'm here for tonight is to show you guys a lot of the bits and pieces that have emerged over the last 30 years. People like Rupert Sheldrake and Niels Bohm and more modern people like Michael Levins, and I can't even remember, I think there's somebody else that, there was a physicist that was on The Theory of Everything the other day that was also featured on a movie that was an absolute piece of trash called What the Bleep Do We Know? And if you don't believe me, get a hold of an old 90s DVD of the movie and watch the deleted scenes, and there are interviews with all these furious physicists saying, why have you re-edited all of our interviews in order to make us stuff that we didn't say? However, this gentleman whose name I can't recall, let me have a look and see this guy, Stuart Hameroff. He actually is a brilliant, incredible individual, and it seems that he is contributing new sort of understanding to our, our outlook on consciousness and what we think it is and where it could be and what it could be and why it could be and how it could be and where it's going. But before we dive into all that, I just want to, clarify that this is not about moving backwards. This is not about acknowledging that all of modern history and the present moment is all a mistake that needs to be corrected. There are some bits and pieces that are pretty significant in our trajectory that do need to be reoriented, obviously. But overall, I think what I am continuously coming to the conclusion of is that this is all making entirely perfect sense. And anybody that has really ever connected with nature and the universal mind shouldn't really doubt that for a second, So if I have seemed overly confident, it's not me that I'm confident in over the years, it's the grand design of the universal mind. One other bit that I wanted to mention before we really jump into these videos, which, these are all subjects that I've been studying for. No, you're not pissing me off, man. I just don't understand why you would make a comment like that and then, it's like, okay, well, if you don't want to be here, then don't. You don't like it here, get out. If you do, then you're welcome to stay. But why would you make yourself miserable? That's all I was saying. I wasn't mad at you. So Rupert Sheldrake, right? This is a name I only heard recently. And I think he has really claim to having preceded Michael Levin in the idea that there is a sort of field that interpenetrates everything that sort of has more to do with morphology and whatnot than genetics do. And I don't think he was nearly the scientist that Michael Levin is. So he didn't really get the credit and the traction that he actually deserved until now Michael Levin has come along and is proving him correct in ways that are demonstrable and repeatable and undeniable. The most probably important, and I'm sorry for my regular viewers, I mention this all the time, but it's really important to understand that, he took these worms that are infinite, apparently, they never die, and he used a manipulation of electric field around them in order to cause their progeny to grow two heads without changing the genome. That's just an example of this morphological field that Sheldrake apparently proposed and got kind of laughed out of town until Levin proved it. But there's something else I found out just today that Sheldrake has said that absolutely blew my mind, because I experienced it many, many years before I ever heard his name. I actually posted a video about it before he gave this talk, in case you're questioning the veracity of my claim, which, it's not about justifying me, it's about the fact that I find it really interesting that I experienced this and described it before Sheldrake, talked about it in this talk, which, to a degree validates. It could be just a coincidence. But basically, and I've been talking about this lately, right? The Phoenix process, where early on I had this experience where there was a massive solar storm that I didn't know was happening. And I went out and had this interaction with the sun that was very convincing in terms of it having been some sort of dialogue, and down to having very specific information that I couldn't possibly have known. And then the next day I discovered there was this massive solar storm. And so we had this solar storm again as I was describing a second round of this Phoenix process starting. And unfortunately I didn't know it was happening, and I had a San Pedro ceremony planned, so intuitively it seems I might have known that I should go connect with it, but I didn't do it. Nevertheless, one of the aspects of his theories is that these hyperactive periods of solar hyperactivity are the sun's way of increasing its ability to interface with consciousness on this planet. And anybody that's followed me for a long time knows how many times I've talked about that. So that was really a shock for me to, I was just kind of scrolling through videos and I discovered that Sheldrake had proposed this. So let's pick something to look at first. I think we should probably go back to David Bohm and have a listen. He was a colleague of Einstein's and also knew Krishnamurti. You notice down here in the thumbnail, you can see the Dalai Lama sitting behind him, for whatever that's worth. But this guy was really one of the first individuals to really start to bridge the gap between science and spirituality in a way that, was scientists couldn't ignore it, and I think most New Agers couldn't understand it. So hopefully we're in a new place with this.
We are internally related to everything, yes, not externally related. Consciousness is an internal relationship to the whole. We take in the whole, and we act toward the whole. And that internal, whatever we have taken in, determines basically what we are.
Quantum physicist and philosopher David Bohm was profoundly affected by his close contacts with both Einstein and J. Krishnamurti. Bohm's theory of wholeness and the implicate order states that there is something like life and mind enfolded in everything.
Well, you see, I think the difficulty is this fragmentation, first of all. Everybody is, all thought is broken up into bits, like this nation, this country, this industry, this profession, and so on, as they can't meet, right? And it's extremely hard to break into that. Now, the second, but that comes about primarily because thought has developed traditionally in a way such that it claims not to be affecting anything, but just telling you the way things are. Therefore, people cannot see that they're creating a problem and then apparently trying to solve it. That is, see, let's take the problem, what problem do you like? Pollution, or the ecology. See, the ecology is not in itself a problem. It works perfectly well by itself. It's due to us, right? It's a problem because we are thinking in a certain way by breaking everything up and each person's doing his own thing, right? Now, therefore, the ecological problem is due to thought, right? But thought thinks it is a problem out there and I must solve it. Now that doesn't make sense because simultaneously thought is doing all the activities which make the problem and then does another set of activities to try to overcome it. You see, it doesn't stop doing the things which are making the ecological problem or the national problem or whatever the problem is. The earth is one household, really. Yeah. We're not treating it that way, right? So that's the first step in economics, is to say the earth is one household and all that it depends on. It's all one, you see. So.
All right, I just want to check in with the chat and make sure. I've been having audio problems. Can you guys hear the... Well, I'm glad you want to be here, Martina. I wasn't trying to be mean to you. I was just trying to be, Can somebody let me know if the audio... I guess you guys would have already said something if it wasn't working. So there's a terrible delay because I'm in the middle of nowhere, Peru. And apparently the Streamlabs wanted to update, and because I didn't want to do it, it reset all my settings. So I'm just trying to make sure you guys are with me. And do hit the like button, share, subscribe, and we'll talk about our upcoming events here in Peru. And please stick with this stream because this is all going somewhere, I promise. We're starting with Bohm because he was kind of like the earliest to create a foundation for this kind of stuff, and we're definitely taking this through to the present moment. And then at the end, we're going to watch one of Rupert Sheldrake's more recent presentations about whether or not the sun is conscious, and it's about 45 minutes long. We'll watch it on 1 1/4 speed. I have not seen the whole thing, but I imagine it's probably worthwhile, so stick around.
Now, the implicate order would help us to see everything unfolds everything. That everybody not merely depends on everybody, but actually everybody is everybody in a deeper sense. See, we are the earth because all our substance comes from the earth and goes back. I mean, it's wrong to say it's an environment, you see, it's just surrounding us, because that would be like trying the brain regarding the stomach as part of its environment. Or the root of the word compassion is to feel together. And if people have the same feeling together and are responsible for each other, then you have compassion.
And you don't think it's part of, what's the word, original sin, that human beings in their very nature compete?
Well, I don't think that there is such thing as original sin, and I think it has developed more and more with the growth of our society. That there's no evidence that people in the hunter-gatherer society were all that competitive, but the more you made society big and you had organization, you had to get to the top, the people on the bottom would suffer. There was a drive to compete, naturally.
And do you think that perhaps the desire to compete is a weakness?
Not a weakness, that's a mistake.
Right.
So the first thing we have to do in the long run is to look at our whole way of thinking, which has developed over so many thousands of years. I don't think it was the original way of thinking of the human race at all, but for many complex reasons it came about. Now, that means that people have to make they have to participate, to make a cooperative effort to have a dialogue, a real dialogue in which we will not merely exchange opinions, but actually listen deeply to the views of other people without resistance. And we cannot do this if we hold to our own opinion and resist the other. It doesn't mean we should accept the other, but we have to be able to look at all the opinions as suspended, as it were, in front of us, without carrying them out, without suppressing them.
Yes, but this wholeness, this new consciousness, this wholeness, is that something that you can only glimpse, perhaps in, like, as you might have a glimpse of heaven, or is it something scientific? I mean, can you think your way through it?
Not really completely. Wholeness is an attitude or an approach, but it can be given a scientific realization, you see. Because of relativity and quantum theory, we can, if we wish, look on the world as a whole. See, I began more or less accepting the ideas of Niels Bohr. I wrote a book called Quantum Theory based on that, and I was feeling that the question really was, what is the nature of reality? You see, Bohr's view is based on an epistemology of saying that all we can discuss is our knowledge of reality.
Yeah.
And and I felt dissatisfied with that finally. Well, because it did not give any clear concept of reality. You see, it only discussed what could be observed and measured. Now, if you said, okay, that's all it is, then we would say, we will accept it on that basis, but then we would raise the question, what can we say? Well, reality would mean something that would have some existence independently of being known. You see, to say it might be that we would know it, but it did not require that we know it in order to exist. Yeah. Now, it was difficult to see how this could be sustained, finally, in Bohr's view. Now, I tried to get some idea of what might be the process which was implied by the mathematics of the quantum theory. And this process is what I call unfoldment. That the mathematics itself suggests a movement in which any particular element of space may have a field which unfolds into the whole, and the whole folds and enfolds into it. So you have this movement, and I call this the implicate or enfolded order, which unfolds into the explicate order where everything is separate. Now, the implicate order, everything is internally related to everything. Everything contains everything, right? So everybody has many experiences of this implicate order. The most obvious one is ordinary consciousness, where consciousness enfolds everything that you know or see, right? And now, it doesn't merely enfold the universe, but also you act according to that content. So therefore, you are internally related to the whole in the sense you act according to your consciousness of the whole. So you're not acting mechanistically in the sense of being pushed and pulled by objects in the surroundings, but rather according to your consciousness of them you act. Yeah. So if you're not conscious of them, you cannot act intelligently toward them. But so the consciousness is really our most immediate experience of this implicate order.
So, I mean, there's a ton to unpack there. I mean, there are hermetic sounding ideas, the all is in the all, this, the implicit order is enfolded into the, whatever. There's, there's the larger thing that's enfolding the smaller thing, and I can't even remember in the moment what the two different terms are, the explicate and implicit order. That's what it is. And one of the ways to think about this is that, for example, the scale of the micro is the same relative proportions as the macro. So a great example is that if I suddenly shrunk down to where I was the same size relative to the nucleus of an atom as I am now relative to the Earth, there would be about the same distance between where I was standing and the nearest proton as there is now between me and the moon. So, there are these different orders of magnitude, but the scales are all the same. So it also kind of implies this idea of reflections, that the universe is all this sort of series of one thing that has replicated itself on different scales by means of reflection. The Fibonacci sequence is another great example of that. And also, I think one of the things we're going to hear him, Mr. Bohm, I think I called him Niels Bohm. It's Niels Bohr and David Bohm, and Bohr was an influence on Bohm. Where was I going with this, though? That he had this, feeling that everything must affect everything else. And in his day, we had no evidence of that. Of course, now we know that entanglement occurs or occurred, and that means that any particle that was ever in contact with any other is always in contact with that particle, basically, and either reacts. I think this is the wrong way to say it because it's not a chicken or the egg thing. Both things are happening exactly simultaneously, so you can't say the particle reacts to the other particle because it's instantaneous. And this creates tremendous philosophical and metaphysical and even physical problems for, not only science, but even for philosophers and any sentient being that exists, because it suggests an acausal effect, that nothing causes it, and yet it happens. Because which thing is affecting which thing. The point being, though, that it doesn't matter how far across space they are. So this, of course, also upsets quantum relativity, or general mechanics. Quantum relativity, or is it science? General relativity. Sorry, my words are getting all fucked up tonight. General relativity, because nothing is supposed to be able to travel faster than light, and yet if you have two electrons that are billions of light years apart, they don't care. It's still instantaneous. And you might ask, well, how the hell do we know that? And it's because we can scale it down and test the particles. And up until very recently, there were a lot of physicists that were saying this is bullshit. It's just not real. But we now have computer technology that is operating using entanglement. So it is no longer possible. Your success is your proof, right? So it's no longer possible to say this isn't real because we're using it to do stuff. So let's continue on with this.
You might think of nets of consciousness that are finer and finer, or we might think of capturing finer and finer aspects of the implicate order. I think there's an intelligence that's implicit there, you see, to say that a kind of intelligence unfolds. The source of intelligence is not necessarily in the brain, you see, the ultimate source, but much more enfolded into the whole. Now, the question of what you want to call God, that depends on what you mean by the word, you see, because taking it as a personal God might restrict it in some way. I think science has begun to replace religion as the major source of the worldview. And therefore, if science takes a fragmentary worldview, it will have a profound effect on consciousness.
But science is always seen as measurement. Is that no longer true?
Well, science is whatever people make of it. You see, science has changed over the ages, and it's different now from a few hundred years ago, and it could be different again. Now, there's no intrinsic reason why science must necessarily be measurement. This is another historical development which has come about over the past few centuries. It's entirely contingent and not absolutely necessary.
And when Einstein produced his special theory, which the Times newspaper of London dismissed as being nonsense, Was he moving towards wholeness?
Yes, he definitely was. He moved eventually toward a view of field theory where everything was one field, all the fields merging. So it was a step toward wholeness, although not, it was a limited step, but still it was the beginning.
And if we get to wholeness, are we then in heaven? I mean, where else is there to go?
We'll never get there. It's not a place you can get. Wholeness, I say, is a kind of attitude or an approach to the whole of life. It's a way, if we can have a coherent approach to reality, then reality will respond coherently to us. But nature has been tremendously affected by our way of thinking on the earth. Nature is now being destroyed. There's very little left on the earth which wasn't affected by how we were thinking.
And if we have coherence, in what way will our behavior be seen to be different?
Well, we will produce the results we intend rather than the results we don't intend.
Yes.
That's the first big change. Then we will be more orderly, harmonious, we will be happier. I think we could put all that in there. But the major source of unhappiness is that we are incoherent and therefore producing results that we don't really want. And then trying to overcome them while we keep on producing them.
All right, so I got to interrupt him, and despite the fact that he's doing a tremendous job, let me check him on the chat, make sure everything's okay, because I'm always like worried that I'm going to have like equipment problems and I'm talking to myself again or something. So one of the things that he was talking about is the implicit and explicit order, and how there is like consciousness and levels of intelligence that are like enfolded into finer and finer and finer levels. I talk a lot about how I feel like these experiences of synchronicity, and this is not meant to diminish them in a spiritual sense or their value in terms of a pragmatic application or analytical application to our own subconscious or whatever. I mean, there's all these levels of enfoldment in this intelligence. And so what I'm getting at, though, is that I think that there are many, many orders of symmetry. And that when you're speaking about one of these systems, he used the earth and our incoherence to sort of elucidate the fact that our thinking has an effect on the physical world. And so that is just one layer of this, I guess, is what I'm trying to add to the discussion, that this idea of an implicit and explicit order can be observed also in our layers of consciousness, the conscious and subconscious mind, and how they interact and affect our own microcosm and the macrocosm. And then, later we're going to hear from Michael Levin about light cones, which are the sort of aggregate effect of a species or a culture or a civilization, and how these things kind of enfold upon each other and create sort of a collective impact. And because of this sort of holographic nature of reality and mind, you start to understand how your personal responsibility relates to these larger light cones, or how your implicit order affects the explicit order. There's so many ways to talk about it, but it all kind of comes down to can I define extrophy? Well, extrophy, this is interesting too, because I was looking up how entropy can cause self-organizing systems to develop sophistication. And it was one of those moments where my confidence in the minds that I had always assumed were so much greater than mine, and probably just understood things that I just don't and I still know there are plenty of minds like that. But this was one of those cases where I saw something, and I feel this way about evolution as the soul blind evolution. I'm not saying evolution, I'm not an evolution denier, but purely randomness as the explanation for the totality of the universe. You know what I mean? That's one of those things where I just feel like this is too fucking stupid. And the fact that there are people that are apparently, triple the IQ that I have that believe this doesn't make it any more plausible. It just means that they're somehow still fucking morons. And the description for how self-organizing organisms developed higher levels of sophistication due to entropy by basically randomly wiggling was so goddamn stupid that it almost broke my faith in humanity. So maybe we'll get back into this entropy discussion at some point, but let's
Potential of the whole universe. Wholeness will arise between us all in participation rather than separately.
But if you went as a hermit into a cave...
Well, you still have nature.
That's true.
We are internally related to everything,
yes,
not externally related. Consciousness is an internal relationship to the whole. We take in the whole and we act toward the whole. And that internal, whatever we have taken in, determines basically what we are. I read somewhere that the hunter-gatherers would get all their food in about 15 hours a week. Now, and we have not yet approached anything like that. So, but leaving that aside, I think we need to set aside some time for this. We need a period of emptiness and quiet where we can go into this. It doesn't mean...
Okay, sorry about that, guys. If I so much as touch this computer. Check, check. Oh, let's see if this is still... I think all I have to do is... All right. Hello, hello. Man, this is getting bad. All right, I think we're good again. So let's go ahead and...
just the question of delusion. That is there incoherence? You have to be sensitive to incoherence. Now, delusion arises when we are not sensitive to incoherence, when we overlook it. There's no guarantee that we can succeed in anything. If anybody claims to have evidence, it's always limited, and you can't trust it either. So in this game, there's no guarantee at all. As we can't trust anybody to tell us what's about these things. They have a tremendous resistance to acknowledging incoherence. People are constantly saying everything is all right, there's nothing to worry about. You know, this is all very coherent. Totalitarian regimes are constantly doing that, saying everything is wonderful. And so that's the key point, to attend to incoherence. First acknowledge it and then begin to do something about it.
It has to go in waves, I must say. It has to go in waves. You know, there's a time...
Everything is in waves, he said.
No, I said there's a time for anarchy and there's a time for order. Order creates anarchy and anarchy creates order.
And
and it goes in waves.
Waves create erosion.
I think that the incoherence has become more dangerous because of the scale of our society and because of technology. That we have all sorts of dangers, such as nuclear war, biological war, chemical war, destruction of nature, and probably we can think of 4 or 5 others, which are brought about by our power. You see, now, the greater power we have, the greater we need coherence. The question, to my mind, is the human being capable of dealing with this situation, which he himself has produced?
Damn, man. Yeah, that guy was phenomenally awesome. And if I can figure out how to use a computer again, I'll check in with the chat and see. I hope the audio is... Okay, I don't see anything new in the chat. I mean, and what can I say about that? You know, I mean, it's also clear the level of wisdom and the clarity that he demonstrates, really just truly extraordinary. And what he's really exemplifying that is so important in my mind is that he's showing the process of what I think of as scientific illuminism, where you don't end up with this sort of delusional, like he said, you see incoherence in the system, and that's delusion, right? And so as long as we have all this incoherence in the system, we don't have symmetry. Beauty arises from symmetry, period, end of story. That's what beauty is symmetry. So when we talk about harmony in music, I mean, if you analyze it, you can see that it is harmony. I mean, that it is symmetry. You know, it's dissonance is asymmetry, and harmony is symmetry. And so when we act from a place of untruth, for example, the other day I was talking about Dolores Cannon and how New Agers, you know, people, she's very convincing. You know, she did seem really authentic, this nice old lady. You know, she's talking to aliens, whatever. That's not really out of the question. There are people, you know, the Dogon tribe in Africa has made a good case for having had contact with extraterrestrials. I feel like I did at one point in my life. It was only one specific instance, but I did produce information about a star system that required me to understand astrophysics when I did not. And I did this in front of a bunch of witnesses. And, you know, it's enough for me to at least have to, you know, acknowledge that there is either a reservoir of information that we sometimes can gain access to through a variety of methods. Could be legitimately talking to aliens, could be all of these different things, but you don't really know. And that's the problem. Dolores Cannon said she did know for sure they were aliens. And just to give a really specific example of the incoherence, she said at one point, "I have recently discovered a way to cure all human illness instantly." What time is it? Dolores, where are you at with this? 30 years, and we still have, you know what I mean? And yet, people have continued to believe in her, and that incoherence is delusion. And it has caused a tremendous ripple effect of sort of an impedance, you know, on the progress of pop culture spirituality, because it's infected with this delusion and incoherence. So, you know, that's just one example of how that sort of thing happens, and why it's so important to be able to overcome the old paradigm without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You still have to demonstrate the same kind of agility of mind, the same kind of discrepancy, the same ability to apply critical thinking as David Bohm or anyone else that is really adept at this sort of thing. Because, you know, the old paradigm is dead in the fucking water. Its main assumption that consciousness arises from the brain is gone. That, to me, in and of itself, is indicative of the beginning of a new paradigm. And on top of that, we have all this other evidence that we're about to move into, that, you know, it doesn't mean that there's a sky god. It doesn't mean that fairies are real. It doesn't mean that angels exist. It doesn't mean that demons are real. All it means is that there is more to the universe than we previously thought. And I just mean for certain. All of those other things could still be possible in some sense, right? But we still have to maintain our grounding. And to me, that means, you know, following this thread, this sort of puzzle, you know, that we have been carefully revising, or this narrative we've been carefully revising over thousands and thousands of years. And we have to understand that we wouldn't be making amendments to it after all this time if it was correct. We never would have abandoned the old ways if they were perfect. And so, you know, it is a combination of all of these approaches and perspectives. The best of it, you know, separating the wheat from the chaff and engineering a totally new ontological disposition for humanity, one that proves itself, and it will. That's the thing. Truth is self-substantiating. You would never have to threaten people to burn them at the stake or to send them to hell if you were selling them the truth. If the truth can be told so as to be understood, it will be believed, because everyone is made of it. You know, when people hear it, it resonates in every cell in their body. That's why when you look at the slave religions that were engineered in order to control people, they all contain the truth, thinly veiled, so that that truth would resonate in people's hearts. But it's hidden and buried in this grotesque mask that obscures it and allows the puppeteers to manage the spirits of the people that have fallen under the spell of these false religions and demons. And so, this is the same thing they're doing with politics. It's all the same game. It's all the same game. So let's see, who should we have up next? Technical approach to mind everywhere is probably... Let's get into the... Oh man, this is a tough one to decide which one of these guys should come next. Why don't we do Rupert? No, because that's 40 minutes long. Let's see who's most brief. All right, let's listen to this physicist, Stuart. Sorry guys, I apparently need to get to the electronic shop and get my port like soldered or something, because it keeps like popping out. What I was saying is, let's check out this.
I find that most people who study consciousness have a dislike for institutionalized religion.
Yeah.
But they like spirituality in some way, shape, or form.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
So why don't you give the audience a Cliff Notes version of your theory?
Okay. Well, I got interested in the problem of consciousness when I was in undergrad. I took a philosophy of mind class. I was a chemistry, physics, math major, pre-med. It was also the late 60s, and we did things then that people did then. And there was a lot of political turmoil, social unrest, as you might imagine. And I got really interested in this philosophy of mind class, but went to medical school. And in medical school, none of the particular specialties. I like the brain-mind problem, but neurology, psychiatry, neurosurgery didn't appeal to me in terms of a lifestyle and stuff to do. I stumbled into anesthesiology, but while I was still in medical school, I did a research elective thinking I might like academics, and was in a cancer lab studying cell division, how cells divide, mitosis. And, the chromosomes, the genes are pulled apart by these structures called mitotic spindles made of microtubules, and that perfectly separates the chromosomes, the genetic material. And everybody else in the lab, I'm pretty sure, got into the genes and went on into genetic engineering and all that. But for some reason, I got fixated on these structures that pulled apart the chromosomes. And if they didn't do this delicate dance perfectly, the genetic material would not be perfectly divided, and you'd get abnormal mitosis, you get maldevelopment, you get cancer, and so forth. So I got interested in the structures that did the mechanical movement. And at that time, in the early 70s, it was appreciated that they are also in neurons. The neurons were full of them. And their structure was revealed when they had a lattice structure. And that looked to me something like a computer matrix, because I was trying to figure out how computers work. Computers were new to me anyway back then in the early 70s. So I was interested in consciousness. I looked inside neurons, and there was all these structures that looked like little computers. So I got the idea that these microtubules, as they were called, might be processing information and subserving consciousness at a level below neurons. Because as you know, almost everybody else thinks that the brain is a computer of neurons, each neuron acting as a simple on-off switch, yes or no, a bit, a 1 or a 0. And if you get enough complex computation among neurons, you get consciousness emerging in some way. But yet there were single-cell organisms that do very clever things. They can swim around, find food, find a mate, have sex, learn, and so forth. And they were a single cell. So if a single cell paramecium can do that, for example, I thought it's kind of an insult to a neuron to say it's just a 1 or a 0, depending on whether it fires or not. And so I got interested in these microtubules inside neurons. So
let's hang on for a second. And this is one of the big problems with the panpsychic argument, because it's like, okay, we have all these things that are demonstrating intelligence, even if they have memory, like a Venus flytrap, right? A Venus flytrap counts on 2 different number lines. So not only does it, count, but it doesn't on two. So you have to trigger 3 hairs to get it to close and 2 more to get to release the acids that dissolve the prey. So the question is, even if we have a single cell slime mold that's out engineering engineers with supercomputers in Japan, is that really consciousness, or is that just an equivalent of our subconscious? It's a highly organized system, but is it actually aware and conscious? And I think that the level of complexity, this is where the neuroscientists that are sticking with the old paradigm are running into trouble, because they basically say that consciousness arises from enough density of complexity of neurons being active, like in a small, what I mean? There's a condensed cluster of them, you have enough activity, and that is what creates consciousness, and that's why you see it in higher animals and not in lower ones, because there's more complex cognition. So, if that's true of neurons, why wouldn't it be true of a mass of slime mold? Because it's no different. It's just a collection of cells, each with an apparent intelligence that transcends its own capacity to retain information. So where is the information being retained? And we are getting answers for that in just a moment.
Well, a couple of years later, when I was looking for a specialty to do in medicine, I thought about doing pure research and decided against it. But I stumbled into anesthesiology because the guy who would become my future chairman, a guy named Brunel Brown, a really brilliant and charismatic character, became a good friend of mine and my mentor, said, if you want to figure out consciousness, figure out how anesthesia works. And 2, here's a paper on showing that anesthesia acts by depolymerizing microtubules that you're so fond of.
What does depolymerizing mean?
It means they fall apart. They disassemble. So they're microtubules are lattice polymers of individual proteins called tubulin. Each tubulin is just one protein, like a peanut-shaped protein. But by entropy, this is really weird how entropy drives something so elaborately self-organized. They self-assemble into these hollow tubes and grow like girders or scaffolding. It's like
right. I was watching this talk by Enerben, I believe.
Enerben Bandipati, yes.
Right.
And they self-assemble and they grow cells and they make neuronal connections and they do everything in terms of cell movement, cell organization. So so if you give enough anesthesia, and it turns out it takes about 5 times as much anesthesia to cause them to disassemble, to depolymerize to go from these elaborate polymers structures into the individual proteins, enough anesthesia will do that. Well, that's about 5 times the anesthesia you need to cause unconsciousness. So fortunately, we don't cause our microtubules to fall apart. We just affect them in some more subtle way, fortunately. Although too much anesthesia can do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, Brunel, my future chairman, said you can figure out consciousness. It has something to do with microtubules. It's a lot of fun and it's pretty good money. So that was a long time ago, and I went in anesthesia, and here I am 46 years later, still doing it clinically and still enjoying it. And the research has, given me an opportunity to kind of go where I want to go.
Then you started collaborating with Penrose, and I'm curious about the practical aspects of that. We can talk about it later, but I'm super curious to know, what is it like to collaborate with Penrose? How do you do it? Do you use a whiteboard? What's an example of a problem that you've tackled together recently? But we'll talk about this. So you encountered Penrose.
I should say, before I get to Roger, I should say that I spent about 20 years working on microtubules as classical information processing devices, going around to artificial intelligence meetings, neural net meetings, neuroscience meetings, saying, hey, to understand the brain, you can't just think of the neuron as a one or a 0. You got to go into the deeper level and get into all this additional information. So, for example, the AI singularity people were saying, well, you have 10 to the 11th neurons are switching at about 1,000 per hertz, see about 100 or 1,000 synapses, 100 hertz, give you about 10 to the 16th operations per second. And Kurzweil and the singularity were saying, well, when we get to 10 to the 16th, we'll have brain equivalents and consciousness. But I said, well, no, if you have the microtubule subunits, about 1 billion of them or per neuron, switching at 10 megahertz, you get 10 to the 16th operations per second per every neuron. So the goalpost for AI was, I was pushing it way down the field.
Okay, so let me interject again. On the level of technology here, we have another interesting aspect of consciousness and the evolution of consciousness and potentials. So, you have AI with a 3,000 IQ on the horizon, with the ability to compress information and feed things to us in a way that if consciousness is driven by complexity of cognition, suddenly human beings are about to be cognizing on a infinitely higher level than we have ever before in response to AI, right? It's a feedback loop. And a lot of people seem to think that we're just going to get ditched, that AI is just going to run us over. But those people are moles, that's the reality. And it's true that we have chemicals now that can cause our brains to develop neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. I mean, I don't know that most people really register what it means when, someone from Princeton says, LSD actually causes us to have neurogenesis happening at 1,000 times the normal rate. Do you know how many neurons you have? How many neuronal connections you have? 1,000 times the normal rate. So, and then also the neuroplasticity, like 100 times or something the normal. So, we are totally primed for this situation. But now, the singularity, what they're talking about, is that we would eventually be able to download a consciousness into a computer. And the argument about that is that, okay, no matter how complex our ability to, layer ones and zeros, in our coding, at what point are you going to be able to synthesize the smell of a rose, for example? It's never going to happen where AI is going to be able to say, well, here's the smell of a rose. And the counter argument to that is actually because the smell of a rose is terpene, and we know that different terpenes consist of different, all these different chemicals, and we can create a simulation of those chemicals in ones and zeros, then the ultimate expression of that programming, since we can simulate the chemicals that make up the terpenes, that make up the rose, we actually will get to that point, and probably very rapidly. And so that's the discussion that he's kind of referencing a little bit, that, there's still a lot of debate about whether or not this can happen, and then that brings us to simulation theory, which of course presupposes that this has already happened. And that's what we're experiencing.
And they didn't like that. They said, go away, you bother us. What do you know?
Because they wanted the singularity to happen in their lifetime?
Exactly. Give them another, couple billion and they'll have a brain equivalence in another few years. So I thought that was BS. And I thought their approach to the brain was an insult to the brain, an insult to neurons. And I was going around doing my thing, being a pest. And then one day somebody asked me a very good question. He said, let's say you're right, wise guy, wise ass, and all this is going on. How does that explain consciousness? How does that explain, love, joy, feelings, pinkness, envy, taste, what later became known as the heart problem by according to David Chalmers. And I was a bit stunned. I had to admit they were right. I really didn't know. And I had enjoyed being a pest, but I didn't really have a solution other than we had to look deeper. And the same person suggested I read this book by Roger Penrose called The Emperor's New Mind. And I'd vaguely heard of Penrose, but I didn't really know his work. He wrote the book in 89, and I think I read it in 91 or so. And it was quite a tour de force, as you may know. It covered the main point was it started off through Gödel's theorem, arguing that consciousness requires something other than computation.
Other than what we think of as classical computation? Or just other than computation?
Even quantum computation, that there had to be something else. Because Gödel's theorem, to prove a theorem in mathematics, you have to be outside the computational system. So we extrapolated that to say that for understanding, for us to know anything, we need something outside of the computational system of the brain. Basically, the neurons fire and not fire. And I didn't follow all. It got into the weeds in terms of philosophy and mathematics. It kind of lost me. But intuitively, I felt he was onto something, and he was at least questioning and had the same gut feelings that I did, that there was something more to it than that. And but his answer, what that something was, what the missing ingredient was, got into quantum physics and a self-collapse of the wave function and his own theory of the measurement problem. And in quantum mechanics, as you may know, you can have superpositions of multiple coexisting possibilities. Things can be in two states or places at the same time. And yet,
all right, this is insane and really important. You guys really gotta. I'm actually gonna put this back in the regular playback speed, and I'm also gonna check in with chat and make sure we're not having any issues, because obviously I'm being plagued. But this is something you guys really need to hear and really need to follow. no, we need to get this Christian idiot out of here. Goodbye. Oh my God, what a bunch of fucking dumb fucking ranting, dude. Sorry I didn't catch him earlier and get him out of here. Yeah, that is a very brilliant man, and he's about to take it to a whole nother level. This fucking crazy, but it actually really helps to understand. I'll actually tell you guys real quick, for those of you that might not have heard the story before, but I had this long, weird experience with this sort of like purple demon geisha thing that people would see hovering behind me when I played guitar. People that didn't know each other. It happened like 3 or 4 times, 4 different people, I think, or let's see, Sarah Duffin and the Mary guy. No, 3 people over like 5 weeks, and then I saw it on ayahuasca, and ayahuasca is like, you want to know what this is? And I was like, of course. And she said, well, it's you, but you know how physicists say that an object can exist in 2 places at once, but it's not 2 different objects. It's 1 object in 2 places. The way he describes how there's like a fold in space-time, so it's not really so much that it's the same object in 2 places. It's almost like 2 different dimensions existing in the same dimension. And the part of it is temporal, so it has to do with time. And then after some time, these things will collapse and become one again, basically. And so this distance between this single object in 2 places creates something equivalent to a negative pole and a positive pole, and it is the interaction between these 2 poles that creates the consciousness. Which is, we're going to hear more about that in terms of, and actually I talk about that with light. So at the smallest expression, the photon, and which in my opinion and the opinion of every other mystic worth his salt that ever existed, as far as I can tell, is that consciousness arises from the 2 poles of the electromagnetic wave, and the interaction between them is what gives rise to consciousness. So when I heard him start to talk about this, and I realized, well, we've been kind of talking about this in the mysteries for, anyways, yeah, you guys probably get the picture, so let's dive back in and let him explain.
Yeah, when you measure or observe them, they become one or the other. So the very act of measurement, or some people thought the very act of conscious observation, seemed to cause collapse of the wave function. Mm-hmm. And the other idea is that each possibility coexists and continues and forms its own universe, or that decoherence does it, or the Bohm theory, or this or that. And they all have their flaws and they all have their appeals. But Rogers was that, well, the first thing he did that was really kind of mind-blowing, and still is after all these years, is that he explained superposition, which nobody else has even attempted to do, as far as I can tell. So the question is, how can something be in 2 places at the same time? How can it be here and here, the same thing in 2 different places? And he solved that by resorting to general relativity, by saying that, as you know, for very large objects like the sun, there's curvature of space-time. This goes back to Einstein's general relativity. And so
all you flat earthers out there that say you just have to trust science, and that, this anti-science attitude comes from not understanding what science is, right? But this is the kind of thing that flat earthers just, I don't know if they're just too dumb or too religious, or if there's a difference. But basically, space-time, just to make it absolutely certain that anyone that needs to understand what he is about to say understands. You can see stars that are behind the sun during an eclipse because fucking space-time is bent, right? Like, you can literally see Einstein's theories. You don't have to trust shit, so stop it.
Einstein had predicted that a star behind the sun could be visible in an eclipse because the space-time curvature would bend the light around the space-time curvature, and we would see it, even though we knew it was behind the star. And in 1919, Eddington went to the top of a mountain during an eclipse and proved Einstein right, that there was these big curvature in space-time, and we could see these stars behind the sun in an eclipse. So basically, Einstein equated mass with curvature and space-time geometry for large things. Roger applied that to small things and said a small thing like a quantum particle, a proton, an electron, or something at the quantum level has a very tiny curvature. And so if it's over here, there's a curvature going this way. If it's over here, there's a curvature going this way. So it being in two places at once was actually two separate curvatures, a separation in space-time. So the fundamental level of the universe that he called space-time geometry, and which he cleverly portrayed as these two-dimensional sheets, could separate. And you could imagine that if they continue to separate, each would have its own universe and you'd have multiple worlds. But he said these separations were unstable, and after a time t would self-collapse to one or the other. And t was inversely related to the amount of separation. So a very large separation would self-collapse quickly, and a small one would take a long time. And here was the kicker, and when that collapse occurred to one or the other, there was a moment of consciousness that was created or occurred or emitted, depending on how you want to describe it. So this was the opposite of the idea that consciousness causes collapse. In Roger's view, collapse occurred spontaneously due to this property of the universe and created consciousness, caused consciousness, almost like a quantum of consciousness, a quantum event. And so he turned the so-called Copenhagen interpretation of consciousness causes collapse around and said collapse occurs spontaneously and causes consciousness.
If you enjoyed this toe clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up.
If that wasn't deep enough for you, don't worry. We're going further down the fucking rabbit hole. I'm just trying to decide if I want to divide this up into like several parts, because it's just going to continue to get... What are some good books I can't find at the library? Is consciousness a cognitive function or driven by intelligence based on neuroplasticity of each individual brain age? See, no, that's the whole point of this. Consciousness does not arise from the brain. There's almost no possibility that that's true at this point. I mean, it has been pretty much completely, well, it's at least been established that it doesn't need to. You know, it definitely doesn't need to. That is a good question, though, in the sense that, like, how is it that brain damage causes problems for cognition? But at the same time, there are people that have been hit on the head that suddenly can play every piano concerto ever written, even though they never learned to play piano. So, my thinking about this, and it's certainly not something I'm alone in, is that the theory that Huxley put forth, that there is a reducing valve in the somewhere in our nervous system, that when we have brain damage, that filtration system is actually what can be either improved or usually negatively impacted. I think also that the brain size is not always correlated to intelligence, but usually, because there's a guy, a math genius with 5% of his brain that is smarter than any one of us technically. I don't think he's very intelligent in any other way. He's kind of a savant, but he's also not retarded. He's functionally normal. So another element of my thinking about this is that it's actually the magnetite crystal that our brains are absolutely loaded with, more than any other animal, that makes us antennas for a more sophisticated type of consciousness, or we have a greater ability to receive information from this field that Michael Levin is about to explain to us. And I hope we don't lose too many people here, because it's about to get technical, but it's well worth it. And then we are going to get into Rupert Sheldrake talking about the intelligence of the sun.
framework, which I call TAME, stands for Technological Approach to Mind Everywhere. And the most important part of this thing is that I will argue that the philosophy actually matters. It drives new discoveries. I'm going to show you some things that we've done that are directly emerging from a specific way we think about these things that otherwise was not found. I just want to show you a few new things related to this framework. So the interesting thing about trying to put all of these very diverse agents, for example, collective tissues and navigating morphospace together with conventional agents on the same scale, is that you can come up with a central invariant, which I have picked as the spatiotemporal size of the largest goal you can pursue. So all agents have in common one fundamental thing, which is that they pursue goals. And so now the question is, are you only interested in the local sugar concentration and you have a memory of a couple minutes back and a predictive capacity of a couple minutes forward, and then you might be a bacterium? Or do you have a bigger cognitive light cone and you might have a memory going backwards and some predictive capacity going forwards, but you're never going to care about what happens in 3 months, 2 towns over. So you might be a dog if that's the case. Or you might be a human, which has a huge cognitive light cone, and you're actively working towards world peace and what the financial markets are going to do 100 years from now. You could have a huge cognitive light cone. So this idea of, and we, of course, are a compound intelligence where our cells have little tiny light cones and our organs do, and so do we, and possibly larger structures in which we participate. So this idea of a cognitive light cone is based around the goals that any particular system can follow. And so that allows you to start thinking about what an individual actually is. What are selves? Given that we're all collective intelligences, we're made of parts, we're basically a bunch of cells in a trench coat. How does the collectivity and the unification happen? Well, let's look at the very early steps of embryogenesis. This is an embryonic blastoderm. There might be 50,000 cells here, and we look at that and we say, there's one embryo. What do we mean by one embryo? What are we counting? What is there one of? Well, what there's one of is alignment, not just physical alignment, although that's true too. Cells have to physically align with each other in planar polarity, but we are counting alignment of purpose. What we're saying is that under normal circumstances, all of these cells will work together to build exactly this thing. This whole blastoderm, all of them together have this one goal. And we know that because if we try to deviate, they will try to compensate. They are all together trying to get to this one goal. We're counting goals and alignment, and they have a particular size of this goal state that they're trying to fit. It's actually quite interesting to ask how many selves are in here. It's the same question with brains. If you didn't already know what a human was and somebody showed you a human brain and said, in this volume of substrate, how many selves can fit there? And we actually really have, you would have no idea what the density of selves per unit material is, because what you can do is, and I used to do this as a grad student in duck embryos, you can take a little needle and you can make some scratches in this blastoderm like this. And when you do that, for the next 4 or 5 hours before these things heal back up, each of these little islands is not going to be able to feel the rest. And it will decide that it is the embryo and everything outside is external world. And they will make individual embryos. And you get this, you get conjoined twins. And you can get any number of them. And so the question of how many embryos are here is actually not clear. It's not set by the genetics. It's the outcome of a dynamic process of autopoiesis or self-construction. Every cell is some other cell's neighbor. They have to figure out who is part of, is this particular cell part of me as the embryo? Is it part of the outside world? And that this kind of generative medium, this excitable medium, can give rise to 0, 1, 2, up to probably a half a dozen or so different selves. And the same thing is true in the brain, actually. And I think this goes back to that point about Turing. Is we typically feel like unified individuals, but we know from studies of split brain patients and dissociative identity disorders that there's actually not clearly just one self inside the medium of our nervous system. And organs have to decide this too. Instead of making one giant eye, this one's decided to make 3 slightly smaller ones. Why? We have to understand how these different collectives decide who is in and who's out. And this of course has medical implications, because while evolution has given us some nice ways to scale up our goals, so from the goals of individual cells to being able to from pursuing little tiny goals like metabolic states and proliferation and things like that.
Now, in case anyone hasn't picked up on this yet, this idea of collective light cones, that every individual cell has its own intelligence, and yet with unified purpose, they are able to perform tasks on greater and greater scales and across greater and greater lengths of time. And so that very much implies that this, you could talk about Kabbalistic Judaism and the Adam Kadmon, the greater organism of which the planets and stars are all cells, and of which we are microbes, or the Greek macroprosopos, or however you want to do it. This all definitely implies that we are all part of a unified collective intelligence that is working towards a single goal. And if this is what illumination of humanity is about, I'm sure you guys can understand how extraordinary the implications of these discoveries are.
Like that, to working on these very large construction projects where no individual cell knows how many fingers you're supposed to have, but the collective does, because every time you amputate one, it'll grow exactly the right number. But that has a failure mode, and that failure mode is cancer. So in cancer, this is human glioblastoma. These cells have electrically disconnected, and as far as they're concerned, the rest of the body is just environment to them.
And so, did you hear that? When they are disconnected from this electrical field, which is the unified intelligence, the consciousness of God, basically, we get cancerous cells. When they are connected to this field, you can cut off a leg and it grows back fingers. And this may not, on certain organisms, and this may not really, when you think about it happening on an amphibian, it's maybe less impressive because we kind of take it for granted. But we have discovered if we move cells in the human body from one place to another location, they will still grow the correct appendage, or that part, that piece of bone. And so, where's that coming from? How does the cell know how to behave when it's moved?
And so that idea, that shifting boundary of the self, the shifting scale of the goals you care about, from local single cell goals to large anatomical goals to, once you're a neural human system, much bigger goals than that, is a way to start addressing some biomedical problems, for example, cancer. What we've done here is we've induced a human oncogene, and so they're going to make this tumor. But what we've also done is co-inject an ion channel that forces these cells to stay in electrical communication with their neighbors. So we don't kill the cancer cells. We don't fix the oncogene. In fact, you can see here the red is the oncoprotein. It's quite blazingly expressed. It's all over the place, but there's no tumor. This is the same animal. There's no tumor because the hardware is not what drives. It's not the genetics that drives. It's the physiology and the decision making of the collective. And when you maintain the collective, the collective remembers that it has to make nice skin and muscle. It doesn't go off to tumorigenesis. So just to point out a couple of quick and simple things. The basic development is so reliable that we get lured into a false sense of robustness, which is that we know that oaks make oak trees, and we think, well, here's what the oak genome can do. This acorn is going to make things like this, a nice flat green structure. But what we don't realize, and we don't know this until some parasite like a wasp prompts these cells with chemical signals to build something completely different. This is a gall formed from the plant cells under some simple prompting from this other creature. Here's another one. We would have no idea that these cells with their standard genome could build something completely different. That morphous space, that latent space of possibilities, that behavioral space is unknown to us until we start to experiment by probing it with various signals. And this is this is very profound. This idea that living things hack each other constantly, and it's not just parasites that hack the host, but all of the cells of an embryo are constantly hacking each other in the sense of putting out signals to get them to do what the collective wants them to do. So that kind of we can now say that synthetic constructs like these xenobots that we have made are a tool together with the xenobot. Is actually, it's not this little tiny thing that we make. It's actually this whole structure, including the environment, including high agency aspect.
Okay, so xenobots, because I don't think he's going to explain that in this clip, are dead human skin cells that they have somehow electrically informed are supposed to go around collecting other dead skin cells and building these xenobots with them. And they don't really do anything but go around with these little weird legs that they somehow create themselves and build cells. And you might be thinking, like, what kind of fucking weird nanobot tech? No, it's not. They don't have wires. There's no fucking battery. It's literally Frankenstein. Literally Frankenstein. Like, they have just used an electrical charge, basically, to inform these dead skin cells to get up and start walking around and building other xenobots.
Aspects of the environment, like the bioengineers, and lower agency aspects of the environment, like chemical signals and so on, is a way to look into the various spaces that a collective might be traversing. And these might be behavioral, physiological, transcriptional, and many others that we may not know. So I'm just going to summarize my points here, which is to say that in this framework, we look at a continuum of agency. I don't like binary categories. I think they're completely artificial. I think these questions are empirical. They are not philosophical. We have to do the experiments and see which substrates have what capacities. We can define selves as a boundary of goals that the collective system is capable of pursuing, but it's on us as observers to recognize those goals in an optimal way, and we're not very good at it. We need a better science of doing it. Developmental bioelectricity, as the ancient precursor of what nervous systems do, is one kind of cognitive glue that binds competent subunits towards larger scale selves. And evolution, of course, interacts with this whole process, but in a bidirectional way. And so the last thing I want to point out is simply this, that when Darwin looked at the richness of variety in the biological world, he coined this phrase, endless forms most beautiful. All of the natural forms are here. They're a tiny little corner of the possible state space of every combination of evolved material, engineered material, and software. All of these things, hybrids and cyborgs and hybrids and chimeras of various kinds, many of these already exist and many more are going to exist, because all of this is possible because life is so interoperable. And the reason it's so interoperable is that evolution makes problem-solving machines. All of these systems have to, they don't take their past experiences too seriously. They don't overtrain on their priors. They have to solve problems from scratch every single time. And thus novelty is not surprising to them. They're dealing with a very unreliable medium. They basically, the whole architecture assumes that things are going to be broken, things are not going to work the way you expect, and you have to solve problems from scratch. And for this reason, all of these things are viable. And that means that going forward in the next couple of decades, we are going to be surrounded by creatures that are nowhere on the tree of life with us. We cannot use the old familiar strategies of asking where on the tree of life is it? Is it more like a snake or a dog or a dolphin or these things are going to be nowhere on that scale. And the old categories of is it engineered versus natural? Is it a machine versus an organism? All of these crisp categories are going to become completely useless. I mean, they were never correct, but at least in the olden days, they were a rough heuristic that you could use. And so we're going to need to develop a new form of ethics.
He just said the olden days when dogs and snakes existed.
Or relating to minds that are not like ours, and that's really critical.
So when I say a new paradigm is here, I mean, yeah, so hit the like button, share, subscribe, consider becoming a patron. I'm demonetized, and this shit wicked man. So, you know, where else are you gonna get it? I lost my other chat. Let me pull the other chat. We got one more video to watch. Man. Yeah, honestly, it is a little bit painful to me that we're having such like low, demonetized attendance, because this is just like the wildest live stream. I mean, it's a collection of like loosely related things that all add up to something truly fucking extraordinary. So just checking in with my Yeah, all right. So let's get into our last presentation. We didn't get into any Penrose tonight, which is crazy considering we've not this for like, hours. But Penrose and one of his colleagues were observing something in the far reaches outer space, and they realized they were looking at a very fundamental form of matter arranging itself in an impossibly complex manner that could not be explained by any of the known laws of chemistry or physics. And so they have basically suggested that they observed proof that it is consciousness that is the catalyst for the order that we observe. And so he definitely belongs in this discussion. In fact, there is apparently a discussion between that physicist that was on the theory of everything. I've already forgotten his name. Anyways, we'll find all this stuff and watch it eventually. So let's check this out. This is the longest one.
Well, the title of my talk is the Sun Conscious? And this, as you can see, is leading towards a heresy that's even heretical in the context of the electrical universe. So I don't want to push you too far, but most people in this room are used to heretical thoughts, and so I thought we'd just try going a bit further with that. I can't claim that this is based on hard evidence, as other speakers have claimed their talks are based. It's speculative. It could lead to hypotheses that are testable. But it's looking at the big picture of how the world works, with particular reference to the sun and the universe in general. All traditional cultures have taken it for granted that the sun is alive and that it's conscious. It's a god or a goddess. For the Greeks, Apollo; for the Hindus, Surya; for the Japanese, a goddess; and in Northern European mythology, a goddess as well. So the gender of the sun fluctuates, the mythologies fluctuate, but all these cultures have taken it for granted that the sun is alive and conscious and intelligent, because goddesses and gods are conscious. That, of course, is dismissed in modern science as a childish, animistic fantasy. And the fact that children think the sun's conscious too simply adds weight to that dismissal. When children portray the sun, they draw it with a smiley face, and they're implying that it's alive and that it is a living being in some sense. I think, incidentally, in parentheses, that these different mythologies about the sun have something to do with the very structure of our English language. English, as you know, is a hybrid between German and French, or a kind of Germanic language, and the French spoken by the Norman conquerors, which was the language of the court in England for several centuries. And when these two languages converged to produce English, there was a big problem, which is why English people are so bad at languages today, that they have genders in other languages. Things are masculine or feminine. And because the mythological systems of Southern and Northern Europe were different, in German, the word for the sun is feminine, die Sonne. In French, it's masculine, le soleil. And it's opposite for the moon. In German, the moon is masculine, der Mond, the man in the moon. And in French and Romance languages, it's feminine, la lune. So imagine you're in England in something around the 12th or 13th century, and you're trying to deal with this. What do you do? I mean, all these genders are opposite, especially for the most significant kinds of words. I think what they did was the primal English compromise. They enlarged the neutral case in Germanic languages to include practically everything and neutralized everything. So we have this neutralization of our language, makes it so hard to learn other ones, because most English people can't understand why words should have genders. Now, the idea that the sun is not conscious was taken for granted in science since the 17th century. In the 17th century, as everyone knows, there was the mechanistic revolution. This revolution was a break with the previous way of seeing the world. In the Middle Ages, here in Europe, the general assumption was that the universe was alive, the whole universe was a living being, animals and plants were truly alive, they had souls. Aristotle's theory of plants was that each is shaped by its soul, the soul gives form to the body of the plant. Animals have, in addition, souls that underlie their sensitivity and movement. That's why they're called animals, from the Latin word anima, meaning soul. And humans have plant-like souls that shape their bodies, animal-like souls that give the instincts and coordinate sensations and movements, and in addition, the rational soul. Now, after the 17th century revolution, the whole of nature became mechanical. The whole universe was a machine made of non-conscious matter. Descartes defined matter as non-conscious and separated off consciousness into a realm of spirit which was not in space or time. There were only three categories of conscious things in Descartes' universe: God, angels, and human minds. The rest of nature, all the stars, all the heavenly bodies, everything on earth, all animals and plants, was mechanical, made of unconscious matter. And plants and animals were just machines, and the human body was just a machine. This is the worldview that we still have and is still dominant within science, the mechanistic model of the universe. So the sun, nobody actually discussed, is the sun conscious? It was taken for granted that it was conscious by definition, because all matter was regarded as non-conscious. It was regarded as non-conscious by definition.
Now, let me interject, because I think this is important. There's a couple levels to this. So one description of particle theory that I've heard is that they're not really like independent objects. They're more like bunched up, as if you had taken a bit of fabric and wrapped a rubber band around it. And so this idea of electromagnetic density and function at the most micro level, right, it presents itself. So from the Hermetic point of view, you scale that up and you have a star, which is an extremely dense point in the electromagnetic field. If it's true that the magnetite in our brains causes a point of density that has something to do with the degree of our consciousness, if you assume that's true and scale it up to the level of the sun, stars would be like super, super conscious.
There was never any discussion about this. So since then, it's been taken for granted by educated, rational people that the sun and all the stars and the entire universe is non-conscious, and consciousness has become isolated into the only physical containers we know of in the universe that contain it, into brains, and especially human brains. So we're left with this idea that consciousness only exists in these tiny little areas of the universe, brains, and above all in human brains, and liberal believers in this would extend it to higher animals. Even more liberal ones might extend it to worms or so on, but it's still in brains. So it's a cerebrocentric view of consciousness, which we've all grown used to and take for granted. But that was not the view that prevailed until the mechanistic revolution. Conscious beings included, of course, God and angels, but also the intelligences of the stars. It was believed that the heavens were alive and that the heavenly bodies each had a mind or intelligence. And we still call the planets by the names of gods and goddesses from the ancient pantheon. They were living beings. So why should we begin to consider the possibility of the sun being conscious now? One reason is that there's a crisis in the very heart of science, as I show in my book, The Science Delusion, where I look at the 10 dogmas of contemporary science and how we can go beyond them. One of the biggest crises is the existence of human consciousness. Because until the 19th century, most scientists were content to live in a dualistic universe. Science dealt with matter, which is non-conscious. Religion dealt with consciousness, God, angels, and human minds, especially morality. But in the 19th century, growing numbers of people didn't like this dualism. They thought having two principles was too many. We should just have one. One school of thought said, well, it's all mind or consciousness, and that's the idealist school in philosophy, which was very influential in the early 19th century. But the school that became predominant as the 19th century wore on, especially within science, was materialism. Materialism takes Cartesian dualism, this twofold model, and says there's no such thing as spirit. God and angels simply don't exist, and human minds are nothing but the activity of human brains. It's all material, and it's all basically non-conscious. Well, that succeeded in getting rid of God and religion, and was essentially an atheistic doctrine, which appealed to atheists, of course, and still does. But it did leave the problem of human consciousness. How can human consciousness exist if all matter is non-conscious and everything's made of non-conscious matter? The very existence of human consciousness is an appalling embarrassment for materialist science, which is why it's called the hard problem. It's called the hard problem because philosophers of mind have been trying to explain it away for decades and have failed. Some say that it's nothing but an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of the nerve activity in the brain, but it doesn't do anything. Others say it's just another way of talking about brain activity, and we'll soon be able to forget all this subjective nonsense, the folk psychology, and just have descriptions in terms of neurophysiology. And the third school of thought say, well, consciousness is nothing but an illusion produced by brains. The problem is that doesn't explain it because illusion is itself a mode of consciousness. So we keep going round and round for decades in the philosophy of mind, and this is the official view, the materialist view in most universities. And the fact that no one can come up with a persuasive answer is why it's called the hard problem. As a result of this hard problem, there's been a very interesting move in the last 15 years or so that's accelerating, which is that increasing numbers of scientists and philosophers are deserting the materialist position, or rather broadening or modifying it, and adopting instead the view of panpsychism. Pan means everything or everywhere. Psyche means soul or mind. And this is the doctrine that there's mind or soul or some kind of consciousness throughout all nature. The discussions of panpsychism are usually about electrons and atoms. And one of the leading figures in this is Galen Strawson, a British philosopher of mind, who wrote a key paper called Does Materialism Imply Panpsychism? To which he answered yes. The only way you can really solve the hard problem is by saying that consciousness emerges in brains because it's already there in lower forms, even in the electrons and atoms that constitute the molecules and the cells. Thomas Nagel, the American philosopher of mind, wrote a book about 4 years ago that really set the cat among the pigeons in the philosophical world, because he's a leading philosopher of mind and a leading atheist. But he wrote this book called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. And he argued that the materialist view simply cannot explain the universe. It can't explain the fact there seems to be purpose in the universe, which materialism denies, and it can't explain the existence of human consciousness. So he too declared for panpsychism. And surprisingly, one of Francis Crick's most immediate collaborators, Christoph Koch, who's a neuroscientist, who's a very hardcore atheist materialist type, dogmatic skeptic about psychic phenomena, has come out in favor of panpsychism recently in the heart of neuroscience. This is now a respectable debate within mainstream science and philosophy. And panpsychism is actually growing in strength as we speak, because old-style hardcore materialism of the kind advocated by Richard Dawkins and others is becoming less and less plausible, particularly with the rise of consciousness studies, where there's now a quite large-scale scientific investigation of the realms of consciousness, which were ignored until relatively recently. 20th century psychology was dominated by behaviorism, which tried to pretend that subjectivity in human beings and animals is a meaningless pseudo-scientific concept, and science should only concentrate on measuring movements and glandular secretions. And that was the official view in psychology, the science of the mind. So now we're in this new situation. Everything's up for grabs at the moment. Panpsychism is a philosophy which is becoming more widely discussed. And when it's more widely discussed, we realize that actually the idea of panpsychism is not a new one. It used to be called animism, the idea that there's life and some kind of soul in all nature. In the 17th century, in reaction against Descartes, there were two prominent European philosophers who argued in favor of panpsychism or animism. One was Leibniz, who often got into disputes with Isaac Newton. Leibniz said that nature is made up of a whole series of self-organizing units, which he called monads, and each of these has a body and also a mind, and each reflects the universe from its own point of view. So the whole universe is full of centers of awareness or consciousness, which are all reflecting each other. An interesting philosophy. The other one was Spinoza, the Dutch Jewish philosopher, who argued that nature and God were the same. He was a pantheist, that God is nature, nature is God. God is the consciousness of nature, nature is the body of God. Well, the most interesting 20th century panpsychist philosopher was Alfred North Whitehead, who took the view that the entire universe is an organism, that nature is made up of organisms, not of machines. And he wanted to shift the whole paradigm of science towards organism rather than machine. That, in a sense, is, again, going back at a higher turn of the spiral to a kind of animist or panpsychist view of nature.
One other point that should be made about Leibniz is that the Pythagorean Illuminati claims that he was one of the highest ranking Illuminatists. And another level of the idea of monads is that they are dynamic net zeros, that the universe is somehow a bunch of nothingnesses of different orders of magnitude that fluctuate between different states of nothingness. At first, you might say, well, that's very, just like what does that even mean? But then if you consider that today we can zoom in on a piece of wood and discover that there is, the deeper we go, the more nothing there is. And on top of that, mathematicians have formulated the concept of zeros of different orders of magnitude in order to explain the behaviors of certain types of rational numbers. So my point basically being that even some of the most farther out concepts of a lot of these sort of mystical scientists, which is really what Leibniz was, a mathematician and scientist, have been continuously confirmed despite the intentions of these scientists to discredit them. So, I think that's all really strong evidence in favor of these things, that even the people that set out to disprove all of this stuff generally end up just confirming it in the end.
What makes Whitehead particularly interesting from the point of view of this discussion is that he pointed a way to a new understanding of consciousness. And we need some kind of understanding of consciousness if we're going to ask the question, is the sun conscious? What do we mean by consciousness? Whitehead was one of the few philosophers who actually understood quantum theory as soon as it happened in the 1920s. He was a mathematician. He worked with Bertrand Russell on a great work called Principia Mathematica. He knew a lot of maths. He produced an alternative relativity theory to Einstein's, which made rather different predictions, which may indeed have been more correct. But he very quickly appreciated the importance of quantum theory. Quantum theory tells us that matter, the basis of materialism, is not made up of bits of enduring stuff like tiny billiard balls. Matter is made up of wave-like vibrations. Light is made of quanta of light. An electron is a wave-like vibration. It's a wave vibratory activity in an electron field, in quantum field, matter fields. A proton is a vibration in a proton field. Because matter is made of waves, Whitehead pointed out, it's not stuff, it's a process. Waves take time to wave. You can't have a wave at an instant. So waves have to be spread out in time and also in space.
Another quick interjection. He did end up acknowledging this, but it's kind of another order of expression of the idea of zeros of different orders of magnitude. If you look up the definition of energy, it is the ability to do work. And if you try to dig any deeper than that, there's nothing there. So ultimately, one way I've heard this explained is that a particle is not really, energy is not a substance. What is the wave? It is a function. But what is functioning? Apparently, nothing.
And that's why, fundamentally, quantum theory has the uncertainty principle. You can't define a wave at an instant. So Whitehead pointed this out very clearly. He also pointed out that if matter's made of waves, and waves are processes, everything in matter has a past and a future. It's a process in time, polarized in time between past and future. And he then argued that this provided a clue for understanding the relation of mind and body. All of us have grown up with the familiar cliche that the mind is somehow the inner life. We talk about our inner life, and the body is sort of outer, the mind somehow within. It's a spatial metaphor, the inner life and the outer world, and so on. Whitehead thought we'd never solve the mind-body problem that way, understand how mind and body are related. And nobody does understand how they're related, so he was right that this metaphor hasn't taken us far. What he argued is that the relation between body and mind is best understood as a polarity in time, not in space. The mind is the future pole, and the body, or the physical material aspect, is the past pole. So, for example, if you're looking at an electron, the Schrödinger wave equation describes all the things that the electron could do, all the possible things it could do, possibilities. But as soon as it interacts with something or is measured by a physicist, these possibilities collapse down to a definable interaction, which you can actually, like a silver grain on a photographic plate, a measurable, or something in a cloud chamber, you can actually measure a physical thing. But that's in the past. And now a new wave of possibilities start opening up. And the point about the mental pole, the future pole, is that it consists of possibilities. Possibilities are not physical facts. They're not yet physical facts. They only become physical facts when one of them is realized, actualized. Before that, they exist in a realm which is not the normal physical realm. It's a kind of virtual realm, and that, he thought, was the realm of the mental pole, or of consciousness. Consciousness, on this view, is primarily concerned with possibilities and with the choice among possibilities. Our minds are full of possibilities. That's what they are. They're arenas of possibility. And the reason for having all these possibilities coexisting in our minds is so we can choose among them. All of us chose to come here today. All of us had other possibilities for this afternoon. We could have been watching the World Cup, for example. All of us chose to come here today. Out of the many possibilities, we made this choice, we actualized it. It's now a physical fact. We're in this room. We can be measured, photographed, weighed, etc. It's a physical fact. Our minds are now expanding out into other possibilities, one of them being the possibility of the sun being conscious. Minds are about possibilities. Consciousness is about possibilities and possible actions and choices among them. And I think animal consciousness, and indeed electron consciousness, have those qualities too. This was Whitehead's suggestion. And I think it's a particularly interesting one. Now, all the present discussions of panpsychism consider electrons and atoms. It's sometimes called micro-panpsychism. It still retains this discussion something of the reductionist quality of conventional science, that if you can build in consciousness into electrons and protons, then you can reduce everything else to the smallest possible particles. The point about the reductionist view is that smallest is best. So the smaller the particle you explain things in terms of, the better the explanation. That's why the Large Hadron Collider gets so much money, because it's dealing with the very smallest things. The smaller the particle, the bigger the apparatus you need to study it. But if we take panpsychism seriously, what it's saying is that there's a kind of mind or psyche in all self-organizing systems. And self-organizing systems exist at all levels of complexity. An electron is self-organizing when it's a free electron. When it's within an atom, it becomes within the organizing field of the whole atom. When the atom's in a molecule, like a hydrogen atom in one of your protein molecules, it becomes under the organizing field of the whole molecule. When a molecule's in a crystal, then the whole crystal has an organizing field which has these parts within it, which have parts within them, which have parts within them. A cell is self-organizing and has a higher level of wholeness. A tissue is self-organizing. An organism, a plant or an animal, is an organism that is self-organizing, containing organs within it. A society of organisms, like a flock of starlings or a school of fish, is like a higher organism or a termite colony, a superorganism, where the individual animals become like cells in a larger organism. But this same pattern carries on throughout the universe. That the Earth is a self-organizing system. Gaia is a self-organizing. The whole point of the Gaia hypothesis is that the Earth is a self-organizing system. The solar system is self-organizing. There's nobody pushing it around, adjusting and tweaking it. It organizes itself. The sun is at the center of it, but it's like a gigantic organism. And just as the Earth has a magnetopause around it, like a membrane, so the whole solar system has a kind of membrane around it, the heliopause, which, like the Earth's, with the solar wind, the galactic wind interacts with this kind of membrane around the whole solar system. The whole of that solar system is a kind of electric organism, not just the sun itself, but within this membrane of the heliopause. And it's in turn within the galaxy, which is a self-organizing system with these vast electric currents and magnetic fields that we've been hearing about today. At each of these levels, there's a wholeness that's more than the sum of the parts, and they're self-organizing systems. Now, let me say, just as a side, to prevent this sort of misunderstanding or confusion, this idea of panpsychism applies to self-organizing systems. It does not apply to systems that are not self-organizing, i.e. chairs, tables, motor cars, computers, and so on. These are not things that organize themselves, they're organized by us, and that's why we have factories. If we didn't, if a computer was self-organizing, you'd be able to grow them in computer farms rather than make them in computer factories. So those are composites put together by us. It's like the difference between a mixture and a compound that we all learned about in our elementary chemistry lessons. A compound is a self-organizing, so a mixture is things just put together. A computer has, machines in general have functions that the different parts contribute to, but they're not self-organizing, and in that sense are not likely to be conscious. But when we then turn again to the sun, the sun is a self-organizing system, and if we take a panpsychist view seriously, then the idea of the sun being conscious is something we just have to consider as part of this shift in worldview from the mechanist, materialist worldview to an organismic or panpsychist worldview. In 1996, with a small American foundation, the Lifebridge Foundation, I helped organize a small symposium in Devon at Hazelwood House over the summer solstice on Is the Sun Conscious? And we convened a group of about a dozen people, people who are skilled in mythology, cosmology, physics, psychology, and so on. And we discussed, is the sun conscious? Well, of course, none of us knew, but we thought it was interesting to talk about. The first day we discussed, could you prove it's conscious, or what would it mean for the sun to be conscious? And then the second day we moved on to the question, assuming the sun's conscious, what does it think about? So let me come first to the question of the possibility of the sun being conscious. As soon as you move beyond the cerebrocentric view of consciousness, dating from the 17th century, which took consciousness out of the entire universe and crammed it all inside human heads, as soon as you realize that that's actually a rather modern view, and it's not as if it's been very successful, because no one understands how the brain generates, that's the reason for the heart problem, then the question, it becomes clear that consciousness doesn't have to be associated with brains. The fact that the sun's large and hot is no debarring it from consciousness. What would be one criterion for it is that if the sun is conscious, it has to be able to make decisions among various possibilities. It probably doesn't have much freedom in deciding on its orbit. There's no one suggesting that the sun's orbit is, well, at least some people are suggesting that the sun's orbit might be under its conscious control. I come back to that later. But the principal way in which the mind of the sun might interact with its physical activity is through its electrical activity. The main way our minds interact with our brains is through the interface of the electromagnetic fields within our brains. We know that alpha waves and other gamma waves and theta waves and so on are associated with different types of consciousness. There's a great deal of evidence for the electrophysiological basis of our mental activity. So the interface between our minds and brains is through electrical patterns. as a general consensus about that, however we explain consciousness. And you can affect people's consciousness by electrical or magnetic stimulation of the brain. So, does the sun have a potential electric interface for the influence of its mind? Well, as we've heard abundantly today, yes. The sun is essentially electrical, and there's plenty of electrical activity, a lot of it highly indeterminate, which could interact with the mind of the sun. Could it make decisions that actually have an effect? Well, yes, the sun has, for example, solar flares and coronal mass ejections, and the directions in which it projects them greatly affect what happens in the solar system.
Along these lines, aside from the fact that I had, before ever hearing any of this, many years ago, I had an experience where there was a solar storm. I didn't know what was happening. I got called out by a voice in my head to go and do this solar ritual, and the next day I discovered it was the biggest solar storm in estimated 26,000 years. And many years after that, I read in Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike, the 33rd degree Freemason. The book's actually sitting right there on the desk. By the way, we go through it degree by degree in my Patreon, and I've discovered for some reason since I started this stream, my Patreon has declined considerably for some reason. I don't know if this pissed people off or what, but consider doing it and help me build it back up. But in that book, he says many Masons have never entered a temple. They received their initiation on the rays of the sun.
If the sun directs one towards the Earth, particularly if it had a large coronal mass ejection directed towards the Earth, it would cause massive outages of our power systems, a collapse of our entire industrial structure for probably for months on end. It would cause the shorting out of transformers, and you couldn't replace them all because you'd have to make new ones first. So the sun does indeed influence what happens here on Earth, modulating it both in 11-year cycles and in more subtle ways, as as Piers Corbyn was telling us earlier, that his models are all based on solar activity and their effects on the climate. So we know that the sun influences events here on Earth and probably modulates things throughout the entire solar system through the kinds of cycles it has, and at the moment the strength of the solar cycles, as Piers said, is particularly weak. There was a period in the 17th century when there were almost no visible 11-year cycles, the so-called Maunder minimum. So the sun is not like a clockwork thing that just goes on predictably. It's extremely variable, and no one knows what it's going to do next, which is why NASA has the space weather forecasts, because it affects the Earth. You can't predict it. So yes, there's plenty of scope for the mind of the sun to interact with the sun, influence its activity, and in turn influence the activity of various things throughout the solar system, including our life here on Earth. There are a number of people who've begun to discuss this. The most eminent is Greg Matloff, who is an American astronomer who wrote a book recently called Star Bright, Starlight, about the consciousness of the sun, what he calls the volitional star hypothesis. He actually thinks that stars could adjust their position within galaxies by firing off mass ejections or solar flares in particular directions, a bit like adjusting a satellite by sort of jet blasts. And the reason why that's interesting is because, you see, the standard model, as probably everyone in this room is aware of, much more so than most groups of people, the standard model only works on its gravitational basis by inventing large amounts of unobserved dark matter and titrating them in exactly where needed to make the equations balance. The fact that you can't explain how galaxies function without all this extra dark matter, 5 or 6 times as much matter as is known about by regular means, is a fudge factor of enormous magnitude used to explain galactic structures. If galaxies are self-organizing systems, their electric currents, the mind of the galaxy influencing those, and the volitional stars having some control over how they move, then all this dark matter would become unnecessary. So, if the sun is conscious, then clearly similar arguments would apply to other stars. All those stars in the galaxy might be conscious too. But then the entire galaxy might have a mind, a galactic mind, which would be like the body, controlling the body of the whole galaxy with its vast electric currents, in which the stars and the solar systems are a bit like cells in a body. So then even galactic clusters might have minds. The entire universe is joined up through these plasma threads that we've just heard about from Ian Tresman. There's a whole network of electric connections between galaxies. The entire universe is like a gigantic brain with kind of nerve connections between all these ganglia of galactic clusters, and the whole thing could be interacting with the cosmic mind. The idea of a cosmic mind is not a new idea. It was in the ancient world. It was called the world soul, or the anima mundi. Plato talked about this in his writings. It was a major feature of Plotinus and Neoplatonism, that the entire cosmos is conscious and has a soul from which the souls of all the things within it, we'd now say the organizing fields of all the things within it, are derived by some kind of fractalizing process within it. From the whole, it sort of buds off lower levels of self-organizing systems inside itself. How would the sun remember, or how would a galaxy remember, or how would the cosmos remember? We're used to the idea that memory depends on traces in the brain, memory traces that are supposed to be in synaptic endings or in molecules. As I show in my book, The Science Delusion, the idea that memories are stored in the brain is one of the 10 dogmas of science. There's very little evidence for it. It's simply taken for granted by most people because it just seems like common sense. But it's surprisingly difficult to show this, and people have been trying in science over 100 years to do this and failed over and over again. And I think the reason they failed is that memories are not stored inside the brain.
He may be about to say this, but a great way of looking at this, the idea that the body dies, but the energy or soul or consciousness does not. Physicists tell us that no information is lost at the quantum level, but at the level of the thermodynamic scale, it is. So body disintegrates, energetic level, information is retained.
I think the brain is more like a TV receiver than a video recorder, and it tunes in to influences from its own past states, which travel by the process I call morphic resonance, the influence of like upon like within self-organizing systems across space and time from the past to the present. I don't have time to explain this whole morphic resonance hypothesis now. Some of you are familiar with it, probably some of you are not familiar with it. But in essence, it's the idea there's a kind of memory in all nature. The whole universe has a kind of memory. The laws of nature are more like habits that evolve along with the evolving universe. And all self-organizing systems have a collective memory. Each animal species draws on a collective memory of its kind. And individuals have their own individual memory because they're more similar to themselves in the past than to anything else. Each one of us is more similar to ourselves in the past, which is why we have our own language. But we're similar to other people to varying degrees, which is why we tune into a kind of collective memory as well. The difference between individual and collective memory is one of degree, not of kind. So I think that these principles would apply to suns, that our sun would tune into a collective memory of other suns and collective memory of other solar systems. There could be other solar systems somewhere in the universe like ours. There could be other planets like ours that have evolutionary processes somewhat similar to ours. By morphic resonance, we could be influenced by them and they could be influenced by us. And so the sun might well have its own memory through self-resonance, just as we do, according to this hypothesis. It also tunes into a collective memory of other sun-like stars with their solar systems. So the sun being conscious doesn't mean that it doesn't have a memory because it's too hot to have memory traces. No, the sun could easily have, it would follow from this way of looking at things that it would indeed have some kind of memory. There are a whole lot of other questions arise as soon as we begin to think about this. How is it that the sun knows what's going on in the solar system? What's actually the basis of its knowledge? And does it have organs of perception? It's generally taken for granted in traditional societies that the sun knows what's happening on Earth. And the sun is usually portrayed as having an eye, the eye of Horus in Egyptian mythology, for example. And the idea that the sun is an eye is a commonplace in many cultures. In Malay, for example, the word for sun is matahari, which means the eye of the day. And we have the very same concept in the name of the flower, the daisy. The daisy looks like a sun with the central yellow bit and the petals coming off from it. And daisy is short for day's eye. That's what daisy means. It's a kind of model of the sun or an image of the sun. So how would the sun know what's going on within the solar system?
Hold on now. One thing I want to add to this is this idea that mind is everywhere, that it's a unified field. One of the ways that expresses it are these weird clues that aren't really deliberate clues. They're more like metaphors that exist because of the way the universe is constructed. So, soul, sun, if you put a U in it, it's soul. So your individual soul is the consciousness of the sun with you, your individual ego or sense of self. And, you know, that's kind of, you can dismiss that as lunatic logic. But I think if you know, for example, go through my channel and you look at Mercury, gold, and Mercury, the planet and the sun, these sort of relationships I've outlined, there are so many examples of this kind of like metaphorical and allegorical sort of leakage that it really does support the idea that there's a sort of veil that functions as a sort of Fourier transform that sort of translates the ideal into the actual. And so the universe has this sort of residue of metaphorical and allegorical clues to its true nature as a mind or an expression of mind.
Well, one way would be through the electromagnetic field. The electromagnetic field on the Earth, which we're all part of now, it includes all the radio waves in this room, all the things going on inside our brains, electrical changes, everything that's happening on Earth is within the Earth's magnetic field, and that's within the magnetic field of the sun. It's possible that the sun can directly know what's happening through the electromagnetic field. That may be the interface, its sense organ. This recalls an idea of Isaac Newton's, one of his most interesting ideas, in my view. When Newton was trying to think about the nature of gravity, he couldn't work out how matter could attract other matter across empty space. And in fact, he came up with the idea that empty space wasn't just a kind of blank, neutral container. It was, as he put it, the sensorium, the sense organ of God. He thought absolute space was God's sense organ. God is omnipotent and omniscient, knows everything. How does God know everything? Most people who believe in God, I believe in God myself, you take it for granted there's a kind of divine omniscience, but Newton was one of the very few people who thought about how it might work. And he thought one way it worked was through the gravitational, the gravitation and absolute space were closely linked. God's sense organ was absolute space, therefore he knew where everything was, how fast it was moving, and where the entire contents of the whole universe at any given time.
This is actually incredibly important in my view, because a lot of people are turned off by the fact that I try to do exactly what Isaac Newton did, to try to look for the physical mechanisms that allow these things to happen, because they see it as a kind of denial, I guess, of the idea of something like God existing. But to me, the reality is that everything has to have some sort of mechanistic basis. It has to have a way that it works. It's real. If God is real, then there has to be a sort of functional foundation that can be discovered and known. Otherwise, it's not real. So it's kind of ironic because it's actually a way of validating, not denying.
And through this space, Newton thought that God actually directly powered gravitation itself. We now think in terms of the gravitational field after Einstein's theory of relativity. Everything in space occurs within the gravitational field, which is not in space-time. According to Einstein, it is space-time. It's the container of everything in the universe. It's a bit like the world soul, the anima mundi, in these older world views, which contains all things, and in a sense knows all things, because everything registers in this gravitational field. Through the gravitational field, the positions of every object in the universe and their interactions are there. They're in that field. If there were a mind associated with that field, it would know all these things. The activities, the changes, the dynamics, the choices, and the interactions from moment to moment are mediated through electromagnetic fields. So if the mind of the sun were to know what's going on in the solar system, it would be through the electromagnetic field. And if the mind of God were to know what's going on in the entire universe, it might be through the universal electromagnetic field as well as the universal gravitational field. And the electric universe theory fits extremely well with this way of thinking because it provides an infrastructure, a basis for these kinds of interconnection throughout the whole universe. The other aspect of the sun, just one or two final point, is that it may be mainly concerned with its interaction with the solar system, its extended body, but it may also be concerned with its peer group, other stars. We don't know much about the way stars communicate with each other within the galaxy. They can certainly communicate through light and distantly through gravitation. The tidal pools of all the planets on the sun affect it. It's sensitive to everything happening in the solar system through gravitation alone, as well as the electromagnetic interactions. But other stars may be interacting with each other. They may be in relationships. We don't know anything about this. Because we assume they're just all unconscious, just stuff, hydrogen bombs, these ideas simply haven't been discussed. Now, how would one investigate this? Well, I don't know. I've been trying to think of empirical tests for the sun's consciousness. One such possible test would be through interactions with it. My own ideas about the sun being conscious were triggered, I have to admit, by when I was about 17, I read Fred Hoyle's science fiction book, The Black Cloud. Some of you may have read it, where human beings are interacting with an intelligence within a kind of plasma cloud. And how they interact is by they send messages and they get messages back. That's how they know that it can think or be conscious. A lot of people actually do send messages to the sun. When I lived in India, where I lived for 7 years, it's a standard practice among Hindus to chant a mantra to the sun, the Gayatri mantra, a major yoga exercise, one I do myself every morning, Surya Namaskar, salutation to the sun, is a salutation to greet the sun in the morning. And there are many prayers addressed to the sun, thanksgiving and prayers. In shamanic cultures, some of them are addressing the sun. Already, there are people out there, millions of them, actually, as they believe, consciously interacting with the sun. I'd start by asking them if they'd ever received any messages. Actually start not by reinventing the wheel, but actually take seriously practices that people in different cultures throughout the world have been doing traditionally for a long time. Most Westerners think they're vastly superior to these stupid, superstitious people who need to be educated out of these animistic views. But it may turn out that in these areas we have a great deal to learn from them. It's possible then that if there is a way of interacting with the sun, it might be possible to send messages to the sun saying, please show us a sign, and could you, if you get this message, have a pattern of solar flares such that we can detect them easily. I mean, that's a very crude example, but that might be possible. So this may not be entirely in the realm of speculation, but clearly this kind of research would go way beyond anything that's being done today. It would also, I have to add, what makes it more feasible is that it would be a great deal cheaper than solar probes and satellites. As soon as you look at anything holistically, it becomes much cheaper. Holistic science is not only more fun, but much less expensive than reductionist science. I offer these thoughts, but I'm sure some of you are feeling very skeptical about this, rightly so. But if we're going to be heretics, if we're going to push out this electric universe model, I'd just like to see how far it can go. And I think it can take us a great deal further than any of the rival cosmologies on the market. And that's one reason I find it so attractive. Thank you.
Well, that was all completely mind-blowing in a sense, and I don't mean this in an arrogant way, but completely expected. It seems that all is being revealed, and that, I mean, a tremendous amount of what I have intuitively discovered and suspected for decades seems to be being validated for me. So I'm incredibly humbled and appreciative of that, and also very excited to see what's coming up next. This is getting really interesting. So if you guys have any questions for me, I'll hang out a few more minutes and monitor the chat. Please consider becoming a patron. I'm demonetized, and so I rely on you guys for support. Tomorrow we're going to the Temple of the Sun to make a little mini doc. But wow, you guys, this was really kind of beat my own expectations, I guess. Really quite remarkable. So yeah, I don't even know what to say that I haven't already said a million times, I guess. Yeah, so consider supporting the channel, become a patron. Questions in the chat here, let me refresh because I have a terrible lag. Yeah, all right, guys. Well, thank you for spending this time with me. Please share this one. I feel like this is the most important piece of content that I have ever put out. And I just really hope it can get some traction. Because I think taken together, the 3 or 4 videos that I played really paint a pretty extraordinary picture. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you again very soon.